Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing fine, and lots of love to each and every one of you. I do enjoy hearing from you, especially when it comes to what you drink, and do let me know what your favourite cocktail is. All these kind of things fascinate me. But before we get started with tonight's story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, sometimes things happen that lead you down a path you never envisaged or imagined for your life, and that was certainly the case with my family. For in my wildest dreams, I would never have envisaged emigrating to America, nor would I have ever comprehended the possibility of encountering the fictitious creature that is known as Bigfoot. Yet both these things happened to me. As the hands of fate, geographically, physically, spiritually and emotionally, were pulling me towards the northern hemisphere of the globe, like a magnet to a bag of iron filings, as possibly some things are just meant to be, and are clearly written in the stars. My name is Chloe, and my story really begins in 1992, when I was 10 years old at the time. It all began when my family moved to a stunning red brick and stone farmhouse in the Berkshire countryside that was over 300 years old. I remember my father was astonished that we were able to get this property for less than the asking price, which rarely ever happens, as old properties in this part of the world with historical character, intrigue and charm are almost always snapped up in a heartbeat. The previous residents were almost too eager to sell, which was astonishing given that they'd only lived in the idyllic farmhouse for 18 months, and they had renovated the old stable block and barns to pristine mint condition. And after all that laborious back-breaking work, they had decided to sell, which was nonsensical. Why would anybody put all their blood, sweat and tears into a building design that involved upgrading the entire farm, only to abandon the finished project? Our estate agent, an evasive, rather guarded young woman called Julia Crawford, was very cagey with us, and she certainly wasn't forthcoming about giving us much information or details as to why the previous owners were selling. But she did infer that they had decided to move up to London. But why, we couldn't imagine. Despite Julia's impotent inability to be completely honest with us, we chose to not concern ourselves with such incongruous and anomalous oddities, but instead we put all our energy and focus into our stunning farmhouse that was as pretty as a picture, surrounded by emerald green pastures, ubiquitous trees, and lots of fabulous hiking trails. Our property was situated close to the town of Newbury, where my father ran a very successful antique business during the week, and on the weekends he thoroughly enjoyed riding his favourite horse Shoelace around the countryside. Shoelace was stabled on our farm in the brand new stable wing, along with 6 other horses that we owned. We settled into our fabulous new home and rural country life with a seamless ease and efficiency, but we did sense something was wrong from the very first day we moved in. It's hard to really describe the fraught feeling that overcame me personally, but I often sensed we weren't alone, and there were times I got the creepy sensation that something or someone was watching us. And then slowly but surely strange things began to happen in and around our home. I remember the first hint that something was seriously off was when we were sitting at the dinner table eating a roast leg of beef with Yorkshire pudding and roast potatoes for our Sunday lunch, when all of a sudden the doorknob of the door in the dining room squeaked and turned, and then it slowly opened, all on its own accord, and then we heard heavy steel-rimmed boots walking past us with a very pronounced footfall, which went down the terracotta steps, through the living area, to the sliding door on the patio, and we physically saw that door sliding back all on its own, but there was nobody there. My parents and my aunt and uncle were at the table, including myself, of course, and we all stopped eating very suddenly, and there wasn't a face around the table that did not look disturbed and confounded. Another strange anomaly was that the room felt as cold as ice, and this happened when the summer temperatures outside were unusually high for that time of year. But I assure you, minutes after that experience, the room remained so cold and very airy, and every single one of us experienced chills down the spine and goosebumps on the skin. My mother's face had grown as white as a sheet, and she looked at us. "Did you see that?" she gasped. Everybody nodded quietly, but no one said a single word, and we ate our meal in silence, as I think we were so astonished by what we had seen and could not make any sense of what had just occurred, and the most cynical among us had no rational explanation for the bizarre phenomena, and I could see my aunt and uncle just could not wait to leave our farmhouse that afternoon, as they were so freaked out by the incident. 2 days later, I woke up to be greeted by chaos as my father entered the kitchen while my mother and I were eating toast with jam, washed down with large mugs of sweet tea. "What on earth is the matter with you?" my mother asked my father, viewing the bewildered expression on his face with a growing sense of trepidation. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "It is far worse than that," said my father. "A ghost I can deal with, but losing all our horses at once, especially my beloved shoelace, I cannot deal with that. I'm at a loss to know what on earth has happened to them all, as they've just vanished into thin air, and there is no sight or sound of them anywhere, and I've searched the entire farm." "You mean our horses have gone?" my mother asked, looking absolutely appalled. "Have they been stolen? I don't understand how that could have happened. We never heard any commotion during the night from the horses. What's going on?" "It beats me," said my father. "This is a monumental travesty as far as I'm concerned. Those horses are irreplaceable. I put all my energies into finding the finest thoroughbreds, and then this has to happen. It's nonsensical. I'm going to have to inform the police about this. I wonder if there's been a spate of horse robberies in the area of late." "That won't be necessary," came the crisp English accent of our neighbour who had entered our kitchen. Lisa Hunter was a very slender horse lady in her early 50s, who was almost always wearing blue jodhpurs, riding boots, a white cotton shirt, and a tight-fitting blue jacket, for indeed I never saw her wearing anything else. We'd only recently met her at a polo match and warmed to her immediately, as she was very easygoing, relaxed and straightforward, and always inclined to speak her mind, which is very commonplace among the country folk here. "I'm so sorry to have to intrude," she said, "but I do have to inform you that last night all your horses were placed in my stable block, and mine were put out to graze in the meadows." "Let me get this right," said my father. "You're saying someone put your horses out to graze in the open meadows and transported our horses from our stable blocks on our farm to yours overnight?" "That's right," she said. "I'm pleased to be able to tell you that your horses are doing absolutely fine and are no worse for the experience. My stable hand will bring them over to your premises shortly, so you have nothing to worry about." "That's a relief," said my father. "Who would do such an outrageous, preposterous and absurd thing like this? Last night we never even heard so much as a dicky bird from the horses." "It is very peculiar," she agreed. "In all my born days, I've never seen anything like this happen before. I'm left to conclude that someone is taking the mick, or having a laugh at our expense, as whoever is doing this clearly knows exactly what they're doing." "Like who?" said my father, looking perturbed. "Who would do such an insidious, disingenuous thing?" At this, Lisa looked rather awkward and appeared somewhat contrived and incommodious, almost as if she was rather embarrassed about what she was about to tell us. "I think this is the artful work of an old stable hand I once employed, over 1.5 years ago. A very likeable, hard-working character, a young man called Eric, who loved working with my horses, but I had to let him go because he stole a couple of my saddles. I wasn't having that. I can't abide dishonesty of any kind." Of course, Eric apologised profusely and assured me that he'd never steal from me again. But by then the damage was done. I knew I could never trust him again. I'm big on the trust lark, I'm afraid. Anyway, when he left the premises with his tail between his legs, he told me, in no uncertain terms, that I would certainly live to regret the day that I ever let him go, and that he would get his revenge on me in one way or another. and I have to tell you, I could tell by his demeanour he meant every word of it. My father looked at Lisa with a befuddled, somewhat perplexed expression on his face. "But I don't understand," he said. "If this Eric left your employ a whole year and a half ago, why would he choose to take vengeance on you so late in the day? Would he not have taken retribution on you sooner?" "That is an excellent question," said Lisa. "I wish I knew the answer to that, but I'm afraid I don't. I am determined, though, to get to the bottom of this enigmatic situation, because I'm almost 100% certain that Eric is behind this perfidious prank. And so I will call around to his grandmother's cottage this afternoon, and I'll keep you posted as to what on earth is going on around here." "I would be most grateful, Lisa," said my father, "if you will keep us brief, that is." Later that evening, Lisa arrived on our front doorstep, telling us she had something quite shocking to share with us, which left us feeling more than a little discomposed. What on earth was she going to tell us, I wondered privately to myself. My father ushered her into our kitchen, and she sat down on one of the wooden chairs around our kitchen table and gratefully grabbed a glass of cold Sauvignon Blanc that my father handed to her. I could see her fingers were trembling, and that even the wine in her glass wobbled precariously, as if it was about to spill everywhere, and my mother was watching her glass very warily, waiting on tenterhooks for an accident to occur, but it never transpired, as miraculously the wine remained in her glass. It would seem that normally the very pragmatic, prudent and unflappable woman seemed incredibly fretful. "Thanks," she said, taking several gulps of the wine gratefully. "Ah, that is so good. Oh, just what the doctor ordered. Oh, I've been looking forward to this all day. What an extraordinary day it's been." She looked at us with a solemn expression on her face. "Brace yourself, everybody, and get ready for the ride of your lives, because I have something to tell you that is so appalling that it's not for the faint-hearted, I'm afraid." "You're scaring me half to death," said my mother. "Tell us quickly, before I have a panic attack," she said, suddenly pouring herself a glass of wine. "Well, there's no easy way to say this," said Lisa, looking at us earnestly. "But I'm going to say it as it is, without any frills, and it's not going to be pretty, as sadly the cold, ugly truth never ever is. Eric, my old stable hand, is dead, and it has been brought to my attention that he hung himself here on your land, in your brand new stable block, about 3 months ago. The previous owners found him dangling from a rope on the rafters there." "Wait," said my father, stroking his moustache reflectively. "Am I hearing this right? Your ex-stable hand, Eric, hung himself in our stable block over 3 months ago, and the original owners of our property found his deceased body dangling by a rope from the rafters? Is that what you're saying?" "That's exactly what I'm saying, love," said Lisa. "There is no nice way to put any of this. You see, I went to see Eric's grandmother this afternoon. Oh, delightful woman she is, and as fit as a fiddle for a woman in her 80s, I might tell you. She lives in a cottage outside of Newbury. She raised Eric on her own since he was a toddler. The poor woman is so distraught to have lost her beloved grandson, but she did say that from day one he's always been a very troubled boy. I think being abandoned by your parents in favour of a drug addiction is likely to cause a great deal of angst and feelings of inadequacy, which might explain Eric's insecurities and some of the strange behaviours he exhibited. Of course, he lived and breathed horses. They helped him to forget about all his problems, but he did have a huge issue with thieving, as he was a kleptomaniac and just couldn't suppress the raging desire to pilferage what did not belong to him, which had become like an addiction. His grandmother told me he didn't even want half the stuff he stole, but a sense of compulsion would overcome him, and he just couldn't stop himself. This invariably meant that he kept losing jobs left, right and centre from all his employers. So I'm not the only person to have given him his marching orders. It would seem that the previous owners of this property hired Eric as a stable hand, and his light fingers meant that he was dismissed from his job yet again. His grandmother believes that this was the final straw. The poor boy was so mortified to lose his job that he'd loved so much, especially because he was so attached to one of the horses in particular. He did threaten the employers who lived here by informing them he'd come back to wreak his revenge on them, much like he'd done with me. I gather when the owner discovered Eric lying there with a noose around his head deceased, he became distressed and really regretted sacking the boy. I believe he hadn't perceived what an anguished, tormented soul that Eric actually was, and how much he'd adored those horses and loved working with them. Of course, he couldn't come to terms with the fact that Eric had hung himself on his account, and was so aggrieved about the whole incident. I think that's why the family actually up and left and subsequently moved to London. "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear," said my mother. "What a dreadful, dreadful story. I can understand now why they were so eager to sell. No wonder that cagey estate agent was so guarded and non-committal when we questioned her about why the previous owners wanted to sell the place for less than the asking price. I must admit it did seem to be too good to be true at the time. I imagine she didn't want us to find out about Eric, as that would almost certainly have influenced our decision as to whether to buy this place or not. I think knowing someone has hung themselves on this land is not something you really want to live with on your conscience." "Which brings me to my very next question," said my father, looking grave. "Who on earth locked our horses in your stable block? If it wasn't Eric, he's dead. So who could it have been?" "That's just it," said Lisa. "I think it's Eric doing all these outlandish things from beyond the grave. I do believe he's toying with us. It wouldn't surprise me at all if his tormented, troubled soul is still hanging around the horses and refusing to cross over to the other side." "Don't be ridiculous," said my father. "Are you suggesting Eric's ghost moved our horses to the stables on your property? How is that even possible?" "You may think I'm completely balmy," said Lisa, "and I can't say that I blame you if you do. But I have been having incomprehensible, illogical and enigmatic things happening around our farm of late. Things that can't be explained, like saddles found lying on the sides of my bath, and horses let out into the fields when I definitely put them in the stable block. I've also heard strange footsteps and whispers when no one is there. So I assure you something paranormal is going on, and it is all making sense to me now. I know in my gut that Eric is responsible for all this absurd activity." "You think it's Eric's ghost haunting the land and causing all this chaos and discord?" asked my mother, looking dumbfounded. "I didn't even know ghosts could be so hands-on and physical." "I'm going to be contacting a psychic medium," said Lisa, "to clear away the negative energy, and a priest to bless the place in the circumstances. And I have to say, it would be wise for you to do the same. I will speak to you later," she said, getting up to leave. "I really am truly sorry to have offloaded this unwelcome news on your doorstep, but the truth needs to be told." Once Lisa had left our premises, both my parents had a hard time dealing with what they'd just learnt. They were beleaguered that our beautiful stable block had been the scene of a grisly hanging, and this disheartening revelation caused my father a great deal of persecution. So much so, in fact, that the very next day he contacted the estate agent to ask her why she hadn't told him the truth about Eric hanging himself in the stable block on our land. "But I told you all about that grievous incident, Mr. Carpenter. Don't you remember?" Julia had insisted. "You never told me anything of the sort, Julia," my father piped. "Why are you lying to me?" "Are you calling me a liar, Mr. Carpenter? That is defamation of character. I told you all about the hanging incident. I clearly remember doing so. You must have completely forgotten about it. But don't you dare go accusing me of lying, or I'll call up my lawyers and sue you." "I assure you, Julia, that if I'd known about the hanging, I'm not convinced I would have bought this property," he said, slamming down the phone, looking more than a little rattled. "What an infuriating, narcissistic woman," said my father. "She's blatantly lying through her teeth and pretending she informed me about the hanging on our land, which she never did. All she can think about is the commission in her pocket. She's a greedy, greedy woman." "Are you all right, Daddy?" I asked. I could see that he seemed rather unhinged. "I will be, once I've taken Shoelace for a ride. I just need some fresh air and exercise to get my head around all this dreadful stuff that, quite frankly, is doing my head in. I knew there was something about that stable block, something untoward, as the energy there has never been right, not from day one, and our horses have always seemed unsettled there." "If you're going for a ride, sweetheart," said my mother, "might I come with you?" she said. "I'll saddle up one of the other horses. A little fresh air is definitely needed after the shock we've both had." Little did I realise that this would be the last time that I would ever see my father alive. My mother was to later inform me that Shoelace, who is normally the most docile, mellow horse on the entire planet, became frantic when riding out in the meadows. It was like he sensed and felt something we could not see, and became frenzied and overwrought, and began to buck and rear up on his hind legs, falling backwards and crushing your father to death. And it happened so quickly. It would take a lifetime to describe to you the desolation, anguish, torment and despondency that my mother and I felt after my father's untimely demise, as he was our rock and anchor, the lighthouse or beacon, if you like, that guided us to safety through the turbulent, choppy currents of life. Now he was no longer there to put a plaster on my knee when I grazed myself, or to kiss it better, nor was he there to read me a bedtime story, or to make my favourite pancakes for breakfast. It was like a bright light had gone out in our lives, and there were times that my depression reached an all-time low, and I never believed I would ever be normal again. My mother wisely decided to sell the farm and move to a cottage in the Cotswolds, but she hired a psychic to clear the energy around our home, as she didn't want what had happened to my father to happen to any future owners of the land. The psychic was a rotund, short lady with beady hawk eyes, who wore her hair up in a bun and spoke in a very deep voice. "I don't need to do anything here," she told us happily. "It would seem that all the negative oppressive energy has been cleared and lifted. Your husband came to collect a ghost boy here on your land, a very troubled soul, recently departed, and now they're both at peace on the other side, and are very happy." "That's wonderful," said my mother, mopping the tears away from her eyes. "That is the sort of generous thing my husband would have done," she said. "Could you ask him what he thinks caused his death? Your husband tells me to tell you that the horse-riding accident occurred because his horse perceived the presence of the ghost boy on the ride, and became very frantic, as horses are very sensitive to the supernatural." My mother looked appalled. "Are you telling me that the ghost of Eric was responsible for my husband's death? It seems that even in death that kid was trouble." "Nothing is ever as black and white as it seems," said the psychic. "The universe, God, source if you like, does not work quite the way that you think it does. If something is meant to happen, it has to happen. And your husband was meant to leave the earth plane. It was his exit point, if you like, that he chose long before he was born. Your husband assures me that if it wasn't a riding accident, it would have been something else that would have taken him from this life, and he is insistent about this. He assures me that no one is to blame for his untimely death. He needs you to understand this fact. He also wants me to tell you that he loves you so much, and that you will meet someone over the waters and be very happy again." "I'm sorry," said my mother, "but that will never ever happen. There will never be anyone else. I could not replace Arthur." Fast forward to 1999, which was about 7 years after my father's unseasoned, tragic death. And although as a family we never came to terms with his loss, it would seem that the gift of time is a remarkable and very generous healer. And although the pain gets easier, you never ever forget, and I wouldn't want to either. I was about 17 years old when my mother and I were moving to the bluegrass state of Kentucky, as my mother had been swept off her feet by a rugged, very handsome American gentleman called Elijah Williams, whom she'd met on a cruise to the Caribbean, and 7 weeks after that romantic meeting they had tied the knot with a very small wedding ceremony. I could see that my mother was exceedingly happy, And it was hardly surprising, because Elijah was the warmest, kindest man I had ever met. And for the first time in 7 years, there truly was a twinkle in my mother's eye, and a spring to her step. I know it's going to be hard, sweetheart, adapting to a brand new life in a new country, with everything so different, but I think you're a resilient girl, and change is not a bad thing. But all my friends are here, I protested. I don't know anybody in America. That will change, said my mother. I'm sure you will make friends. Elijah assures me that the southern hospitality in Kentucky is second to none, and people will make you feel very welcome there. My mother wasn't wrong, as North America welcomed me to her bosom with open arms like a maternal matriarch, and not for a moment did I feel out of place, but I was enveloped with a sense of belonging. The people in the quaint North American town were among the nicest, most convivial people that I have met in my entire life, and were eager to make my acquaintance and to befriend me. While Kentucky was so large and spacious compared to the English countryside where I'd grown up, it was indeed exquisitely beautiful, and I was mesmerised by the undulating green pastures, flowery meadows, V-shaped valleys, silvery lakes, and ubiquitous areas of natural forest, not to mention the indigenous wildlife, which was a delight to behold. Elijah lived on a sizable farm in a charming colonial-style farmhouse that had been in his family for over 3 generations, and although he grew corn on the land, he also ran his own workshop from a large shed on the premises that was like an Aladdin's cave of retrograde, obsolete treasures that had been rusted, corroded and tarnished by time, that he had fixed up and restored, like old cars, petrol pumps, signs, clocks, merry-go-rounds, popcorn machines and stuff like that. He was masterfully skilled with his hands, and could return a vintage treasure from the scrap heap back into its former glory. It was through Elijah's work that I met my boyfriend Charles Tyler, who was very eager to become Elijah's apprentice. For some reason, from the moment we met, we just connected, and in a trice we were spending all our spare time together, cycling down country lanes on our bicycles, riding horses, or exploring the forests in the area. As in all my born days, I have never been so beguiled and bedazzled by some of these shaded retreats or verdant sanctuaries with their tall, statuesque trees and exquisite fauna and flora. My story begins on an ordinary Saturday morning in early spring, when the weather was warm and sunny with a gentle breeze, and Charles and I decided that it was the quintessential day for a picnic, and so we cycled down some pretty country lanes in search of the perfect spot, which ended up being in a flowery meadow full of pretty yellow, white and purple daisies, cat's ears and bluegrass, with an arresting view over a fenced-in grazing pasture where bay and black Arabian horses were grazing. This prepossessing open meadow was fringed by the arresting white blossoms of the serviceberry trees, mixed with the pink blossoms of the dogwoods, along with oaks, maples and walnuts that spread out into an extensive expanse of wood green. I spread out the red and white checkered tablecloth onto the long grass, which we pressed down to create a flat platform. We opened up our Tupperware containers filled with delicious food, which included fried chicken, buttermilk biscuits, sweet potato pie, cornbread, barbecue potato chips, and egg and ham sandwiches, along with large bottles of peach iced tea. We were about to eat our picnic when we heard a strange scream that was so terrifying that it sounded like a woman was being murdered, and Charles and I were convinced that someone was in serious trouble and that a woman was being attacked in the woods. Charles frantically looked for something to use as a weapon and found a sizable piece of timber. "I'm going to see what's going on," he said. "I think a woman is being assaulted in those trees. You stay over there." "Are you kidding me?" I said, searching for a long piece of timber myself to use as a makeshift weapon. "You can't leave me here alone. I'm coming too." Once again we heard the woman's frantic, terrified screams, and we were almost certain she was being brutally attacked. We could only hope we could get to her in time, but the sound was so piercing I was left feeling very certain we would find a dead body on our hands, as the scream sounded like the woman was literally dying. My heart was thundering through my chest like a heavy drum as we dashed through the wood green, but the trouble was that the screaming had stopped, and there was no sign of the mysterious woman anywhere, despite much intensive searching. "I don't think this is a woman in trouble," said Charles. "Maybe we heard some kind of animal, but what it was, I can't imagine." "Are you sure?" I asked. "It did sound like a woman. I'm wondering if these woods is haunted and the screams are paranormal. It is a possibility, you know." "Haunted?" laughed Charles. "Where did you get that idea from?" "Come on," he said, taking my hand. "Let's go back to our picnic and finish what we started before we were so rudely interrupted by those screams." Imagine our amazement when we approached our picnic spot to see what looked like a huge black bear sitting on our picnic rug, with its massive back turned away from us. It appeared to be eating all our food, which was spread out decadently all over the tablecloth. "Oh my goodness," said Charles, "a black bear. That's all we need." He began to lift up a stone to throw at the creature. I stopped him in his tracks. "Charles, what on earth are you doing?" "I'm scaring the black bear away from our picnic spot," he assured me, throwing the stone at the creature. All of a sudden, the creature stood up on 2 powerful legs, towering at about 7 foot tall, and swivelling around to look directly at us. But this was no bear. What on earth was it? I was so astonished by what I was perceiving. Everything seemed so surreal that for a moment I was literally too flabbergasted to even be afraid. I could hear Charles say, "What the heck is that?" The creature was so human in appearance that it was uncanny. Granted, there were some ape-like aspects to his anatomy, which I discerned, most notably in the pyramid shape of the head, the overlong arms, and the powerful muscular density of the critter's framework, for this creature was literally built for speed, power, endurance, and strength, and its rock-hard body was solid and burly. To put it mildly, he was one of the most intimidating creatures I have ever beheld, and easily as awesome as an elephant, rhino, or even a lion. The creature did not look amused at being assaulted by a stone, and curled its lips back and began to scream at us. It was the very same terrifying murderous scream that had led us to believe that a woman was being attacked in the first place. I was so terrified that I began to shake and wobble like a jelly. And I was desperate to run away, but it was like I could not get my brain into gear to fire up any movement in my legs. I was as still as a car that simply refuses to start on a cold winter's morning, no matter how hard you press down on that accelerator. "Run! Run, Chloe! Run!" I heard Charles screaming at me. "Run, now!" I could feel the tears pouring down my cheeks, as this creature was so terrifying, but I was so incapacitated by fear, I was certain I was about to be attacked and killed violently by this beast. The next thing I knew was that Charles lifted me up into his arms and began to run with me. I could see the creature almost jogging behind us, and it was snarling, grunting, and screaming. Charles put me down when we reached our bicycles, and even to this day I have no idea how I managed to climb onto my bike seat and manoeuvre it down the country lane, but we both pedalled furiously down that road as fast as we possibly could, while this curious creature was literally jogging behind us, swinging its overlong arms backwards and forwards and throwing pebbles it picked up on the road at our bikes, and it continued to scream. Many of those pebbles hit our bicycles and nearly caused me on a couple of occasions to fall over, but luckily I didn't. I don't recall a time when I was more afraid, and when we got back to the house, I was trembling so much that it took several cups of sweet hot tea to bring me back to my senses. "What the hell happened to the two of you?" asked Elijah. "And why is Chloe shaking so much, Charles?" "We've just seen a monster." We proceeded to tell Elijah what had happened, and he was silent for a long moment, and then he spoke. "You would have been fine if you hadn't antagonized the creature by throwing a stone at it. You do realize that it was a foolish thing to do. It was like you were asking for trouble." "I was trying to shoo it away," said Charles. "I thought it was a bear." "Word to the wise," said Elijah. "Always make sure you know what you're dealing with before you begin to confront it." "You sound like you know what the kids saw, sweetheart," said my mother. "I believe they saw a wild man," said Elijah. "My grandfather told me about these beings once. They're usually benevolent, unless they're challenged." "This one was very aggressive," I assured Elijah, "and it was eating our picnic." "Chloe, if I threw a stone at you, how would you react?" asked Elijah. "Well, I'd run away." or I'd fight back, I said. Well, don't you see, the creature fought back because he thought he was being challenged. Well, I hadn't actually thought of it like that, I admitted. Looking back all these years later, I know that Charles, who is now my husband, and I both encountered a Bigfoot, and I feel remarkably privileged to have seen the creature, although I wish the experience had been congenial. I do believe that if Charles had not been so ignorant as to throw a stone at the creature, our whole encounter with him could have been so different. But you can't live with regret. So there you are. That's my story. What a fantastic story. Until next time, goodbye and good night, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.